He thought he would find nothing but dirt and debris at the bottom of the city's oldest canal. But when the water finally drained, the workers saw an object the city had been silent about for more than a century. What was hidden beneath the layers of silt changed everything. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The city awakened each morning with a familiar rhythm, a blend of ancient stone breathing under the first light of dawn and the muted hum of modern life rolling through narrow streets. For centuries, it had expanded, reshaped itself, erased parts of its own memory only to rebuild them anew. Yet there were places that refused to surrender to time, corners so deeply woven into its identity that even progress could not replace them. One of these enduring landmarks was the great canal cutting through the heart of the city. Its long ribbon of water once considered the pride and pulse of the entire region. Long before throngs of tourists with cameras and backpacks discovered its charm, the canal had served a far more practical and vital purpose. It brought life into the city, fresh water, trade, transportation, and opportunity. The oldest maps depicted it as a bold blue artery bordered by the elegant signatures of long-forgotten engineers and surveyors. Festivals once filled its banks with music and laughter. Lanterns cast shimmering reflections across the rippling surface. Boats slid quietly between stone walls while merchants shouted to one another as they unloaded goods from their barges. But that era had vanished long ago. Over decades, the canal did not merely lose its significance, it became a victim of its own history. It was no longer a symbol of prosperity. Its water had grown cloudy and stagnant, coated by a thick layer of silt, while decades of discarded objects accumulated unseen beneath the surface. Tourists took pictures of the old bridges, but instinctively kept their distance from the sharp smell rising on warm summer days. Local residents remembered strolling along clean waters in their youth, but now hurried past, choosing not to linger. The canal had become a wound the city tried to hide but could not heal. For Mark, a dark-skinned man who had grown up in one of the modest neighborhoods not far from the canal, it held a different meaning. As a child, he never noticed the filth or decay. He saw reflections, heard voices, felt the quiet breathing of the city through its waters. To him, the canal seemed alive, constant, something that had always existed and always would. But adulthood had a way of stripping illusions. Years of working on the city's hydraulic systems exposed him to the parts no one else saw. Decaying wooden supports of old locks, dangerous voids beneath the walls, the endless mass of garbage dumped into the water over decades. He watched the canal transform, step by step, into a dark ribbon of stagnant water, a symbol of a forgotten past. When the city council finally voted to drain the canal entirely, exposing its bed for the first time in history, Mark did not see it as just another assignment. He understood this event might change far more than the city anticipated. This would not be an ordinary maintenance project. It would be an attempt to return the canal to its rightful place in the city's heritage, to uncover whatever lay hidden beneath layers of mud, weeds, and debris. Environmental groups had demanded this cleanup for years. Journalists warned of sanitary risks. Tourism companies complained about decline in interest. And so, at last, the project was approved. Materials were ordered, equipment assigned, schedules drafted. Mark was chosen to lead operations on the central section, the oldest and most problematic part of the entire canal. It was a recognition of his years of experience, but also a great burden. He knew exactly where forgotten arches lay buried behind the stone walls, concealed during past renovations. He knew which tunnels ran beneath the streets and where long-abandoned drainage channels ended. He knew the weak spots where the concrete clung to the walls by little more than habit, and the areas where mud was thicker than water. On the first day of the operation, the city seemed to hold its breath. Workers erected temporary dams and shut off the canal's inlets. Specialists monitored the pressure levels, the pace of the withdrawal, and the structural integrity of the canal walls. Slowly, the water receded, leaving behind shiny streaks of mud. The first meters of exposed bed looked almost extraterrestrial. Uneven mounds and dark patches, slick crusts of silt, metallic fragments protruding like fossils. It all appeared strangely surreal against the backdrop of historic facades accustomed to the water concealing the ugliness beneath. People began gathering along the embankments. Some came out of curiosity, others to film the event. Children found the sight fascinating. Adults seemed uneasy. Journalists hovered with cameras ready, and the canal rewarded them quickly. As the water sank further, chaos revealed itself. Mangled bicycles, rusted scooters, broken televisions, fragments of furniture, even sections of traffic barriers that had mysteriously vanished years before. It looked as though the canal had become a giant sinkhole into which the city had poured everything it wished to forget. From the temporary platform, Mark surveyed the unfolding scene. His team worked with surprising coordination, though many had never seen a drained canal bed before. But what struck Mark most was not the trash or the smell. It was the sense that the water, as it withdrew, was exposing something deeper. The layer of silt was far thicker than previous studies had suggested. In some spots, the ground collapsed beneath their boots, forming sudden hollows. In others, the tools skidded on compacted surfaces, as though the mud hid something more solid than stone. Mark felt a strange intuition stirring. The bed of the canal did not feel like mere earth and debris. Something seemed partially concealed beneath the filth, something shaped, perhaps, or meant to be hidden. He could not yet name what he sensed, but the feeling settled in his chest with increasing certainty. This project would not end with simple cleaning. Ahead lay weeks of grueling work, thousands of hours of excavation, endless reports, and the coordination of dozens of workers. But as Mark stood over the exposed bed of the canal, he understood that what awaited them was far more significant than rusted bicycles and forgotten appliances. The city, he realized, was preparing to tell a story it had buried long ago, and he, Mark, would be the first to hear it. When the first week of the massive operation came to an end, the canal no longer resembled Daja Blednoi Teni Svojego Prejnego Vida. What had once been a calm ribbon of water reflecting the city's bridges and balconies had transformed into a sprawling, uneven landscape of exposed mud, half-buried objects, and the remnants of decades of neglect. The rhythmic sounds of machinery, boots sinking into sludge, and metal hooks scraping against unknown surfaces replaced the usual gentle lapping of water. What had seemed shocking on the first day soon became the new normal, and the workers adapted to this inhospitable terrain with surprising speed. Yet, even as they adjusted physically, the emotional weight of the task continued to grow heavier with each new item dragged from the depths. Mornings for Mark began long before the sun rose. He arrived earlier than everyone else, needing an hour of silence to walk along the canal bed and organize the tasks for the day. The canal floor, still soft in many areas, held the previous day's footprints like frozen shadows. The scent of mud mixed with the stale odor of long submerged debris. There were moments when Mark felt as if he were wandering through the skeleton of a forgotten city lying beneath the visible one. With each step, he saw something new. half of a rusted bicycle frame jutting out of the ground like the branch of a dead tree, shattered pieces of ceramic tiles, tangled metal cables, or remnants of wooden crates barely holding their shape. Some sections looked like chaotic dumps, others like archaeological sites untouched for centuries. His team gradually arrived in groups, still sleepy, yet already joking or complaining about the cold, the mud, or the constant odor. Despite their fatigue, they worked with discipline. This job was different from anything they had done before, and everyone understood the historical significance of it. Mark divided them into clusters, assigning each a specific zone. It was essential to keep the work evenly distributed because every square meter of sludge held the potential for both danger and discovery. The mud was treacherous. Step in the wrong place, and a boot could sink so deeply that it required 2 men to pull someone out. In other areas, beneath only a thin layer of sludge, hidden sharp metal lurked. Rusted nails, twisted rebar, jagged pipes. Protective gear was mandatory, and even so, injuries were not uncommon. As the workers combed through the mess, the variety of objects they found painted an unintentionally honest portrait of the city's past. Modern waste dominated the upper layers: plastic bottles, crushed food containers, children's toys, fragments of packaging, and thousands of cigarette butts. But beneath this recent layer lay older relics that carried a different weight. Broken cassette tapes, pieces of radios, blackened remnants of boom boxes, iron bed frames, typewriters with missing keys, and even a bulky old television set from the late 20th century. These items conjured images of other eras, other lives, and other reasons why they had ended their existence beneath the canal waters. Some might have been thrown away in anger or carelessness, others perhaps lost in accidents, or stolen and later discarded. Yet, the deeper the workers dug, the more curious the findings became. Shards of glass that seemed handmade, old coins blackened by oxidation, parts of early street lamps no longer used, and fragments of ornate railings that likely had once adorned elegant balconies long before the city was renovated. These items, while mundane, carried an undeniable dignity. They represented real history, small, silent witnesses to time. Mark observed everything meticulously. He documented unusual discoveries, instructing the team to photograph certain areas before disturbing anything. The work was not purely mechanical. It was detailed, careful, almost archaeological. Crowds still gathered every day along the walkways overlooking the canal. Even in cold weather, people arrived early, leaning over the railings to watch the teams wrestle with what the city had lost beneath its own neglect. Children pointed excitedly at each object pulled out with hooks or lifted by machinery. Some older residents claimed they remembered when certain items had fallen into the water or had been rumored to be there. A few even shouted theories, adding a theatrical layer to the already surreal atmosphere. Journalists continued to appear, eager to capture unusual finds. They filmed workers pulling up a rusted motorcycle, an entire metal bed frame, dozens of shopping carts fused together by corrosion, and a refrigerator so decayed that its door dissolved when touched. Each image fueled public fascination. Mark, however, was growing uneasy. He noticed something strange during his early rounds, something that didn't match the usual inconsistency of the canal floor. In one of the central sections, the mud behaved in an unusual way. His tools resisted digging there. Attempts to insert metal poles met with unexpected smoothness beneath the surface, not rough, natural obstruction, but rather the chilling uniformity of something manufactured. When workers tried to break through the layer of sediment with heavier equipment, the tools slid off as though glancing over the top of a buried structure. At first, he brushed off the observation. The canal had undergone many reconstructions in its history. Old docks, forgotten retaining walls, and half-abandoned tunnels were not unheard of. But the consistency here was too perfect, too planar. When he knelt and scraped away the mud by hand, he felt beneath his fingers a texture that couldn't possibly be natural. Cold, solid, and metallic. The mud above it had compacted differently than elsewhere, as though it had been deliberately layered over time or artificially filled in during some long-forgotten maintenance project. He instructed his team to focus their efforts elsewhere for the moment, not drawing unnecessary attention to his suspicions. Crowds above were hungry for spectacle, and the media were desperate for dramatic footage. It wouldn't help to stir anything before he understood what exactly they were dealing with. Still, every time he looked toward that section of the canal, he felt the weight of an unrelenting pull, as though the ground itself were urging him to dig deeper. Throughout the next days, the sense of strangeness only intensified. The metal beneath the mud appeared in small patches as the upper layers loosened from nearby movements. Thin slivers of rust, hard lines beneath the sludge, the faintest geometric angles that natural stones would never form. One afternoon, a worker accidentally stepped on one of the exposed corners, and the sound that echoed, dull, heavy, unmistakably metallic, drew everyone's attention. Mark approached immediately, asked the worker to step aside, and crouched to examine the spot. Beneath only a few centimeters of mud lay something undeniably large, smooth, and artificial. He ordered the team to cordon off the area and limit access. At the same time, he quietly sent a request for additional equipment to handle delicate excavation work. The city's administrators were surprised. This was not part of the original plan, but they approved it, trusting his judgment. They knew that Mark was not a man prone to exaggeration. While waiting for reinforcements, he returned repeatedly to the strange patch of ground. Early in the morning, before anyone else arrived, he scraped the surface in widening circles. The more mud he cleared, the more convinced he became that this was not the remains of a boat, not a pipe, not a section of old wall. It was something built intentionally, something far larger and more complex than a random object discarded into the canal. He traced his fingers along the edge of the metal, finding what felt like a seam, a straight, unmistakable line. Parallel to it, barely discernible through the compacted mud, another seam ran with the same precision. It was as if he had uncovered the corner of a door, but what door could possibly be buried under the canal, and who would have placed it there? By the end of the second week, Mark's unease had fully transformed into certainty. The canal was hiding something beneath its surface, something huge, constructed deliberately, concealed intentionally, and forgotten for generations. His mind sifted through everything he knew about the city's history. Could it be an old service chamber, a spillway, a maintenance vault that had been sealed before modern infrastructure replaced the old labyrinth beneath the streets? But nothing he recalled fit the scale of what he was touching. The mud over the structure felt different too. It had layered more thickly, compressed more densely, as though decades of sediments had settled unevenly in this spot. Perhaps the water currents behaved differently here. Or perhaps, more intriguingly, years ago someone had attempted to bury whatever lay beneath as deeply as possible. Nevertheless, the work had to continue with the same outward routine. Mark guided his team kada dia proiti bolshuiu chast kanala, clearing mountains of debris that continued to reveal themselves as the days passed. Although the process became repetitive, it never lost its strangeness. Every item hauled out felt like a fragment of a collective memory that had been dropped into the water and left to rot. Workers laughed when they pulled up bizarre items, like a mannequin torso, an ancient radio, a bicycle missing both wheels, or a set of kitchen pots fused together. But beneath the humor, there was always an undercurrent of discomfort. The canal had swallowed too much. It had become a reliquary of everything the city wanted to forget. As public fascination intensified, the pressure on Mark increased. City officials demanded regular updates. Journalists asked endless questions, and onlookers scrutinized every move the workers made. But in the midst of all this noise, the hidden metallic object remained the one thing Mark could think about. It was as though the canal, despite being drained and silent now, whispered through layers of mud, urging him to uncover its truth. One evening, long after most workers had gone home, Mark stayed behind. The last light of the day faded, and shadows stretched across the exposed bed. The metallic surface he had partially uncovered glinted faintly, catching the last rays of sun. He climbed down carefully, flashlight in hand. The mud sucked at his boots, but he moved deliberately, guided by instinct more than reason. He reached the structure, crouched, and illuminated the metal. The beam of light revealed an unmistakable edge, a rectangular form, too precise to be anything but man-made. He brushed the surface again, slower this time. His fingertips traced contours that felt engineered, designed with purpose. The more he uncovered, the stronger his conviction grew. This was a door. A sealed, heavy, industrial door. For a long time he simply remained there in silence, kneeling before the buried structure, feeling the gravity of its presence. The canal had been drained for only a matter of days, but it already looked as though it had been waiting for centuries. And now, after generations of being hidden beneath water and silt, it had finally revealed the first fragment of its secret to him. By the time he climbed back up to the walkway, the city lights were sparkling above like scattered stars. Mark paused, looking down at the canal bed, and realized that this was only the beginning. The full truth of what lay beneath was still concealed under tons of mud, but he knew with absolute certainty that the canal was no longer simply a site of pollution or neglect. It was now a doorway, literally and figuratively, to something buried deep within the city's forgotten history. And soon, very soon, the rest of the world would have to confront what he had already begun to uncover. The night after Mark confirmed his suspicions was restless, filled not with dreams, but with the echoes of unanswered questions. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint outline of the metallic surface buried beneath the mud, the clean, straight seam running along its edge, the cold certainty that it was a door, an entrance to something built long before anyone now living had been born. When dawn finally arrived, pale and muted over the city's rooftops, he felt the weight of the day already pressing on his shoulders. Whatever lay beneath the canal was no longer an odd curiosity or a minor anomaly. It was a revelation waiting to break open, and he knew that events would soon accelerate far beyond the quiet secrecy he had managed to maintain. The workers gathered early that morning, just as they had every day since the project began. But Mark sensed the atmosphere shifting. Whispers were beginning to move through the ranks. Some of the crew had noticed the section he kept taped off, the equipment piled nearby, the way he spent more time than usual directing people away from that specific area. Curiosity was growing, and he knew he couldn't delay the inevitable much longer. The arrival of the additional tools he'd requested would force the matter into the open anyway, and soon the city officials would demand explanations. By midday, the reinforcements had arrived, specialized stabilization equipment, portable scanning devices, and a team trained for delicate excavation work. The city's Public Works Department had arrived with them, sending representatives who wanted to observe progress firsthand. Some were skeptical, some indifferent, and some, particularly those who had heard Mark's brief description of the discovery, were excited. He allowed them to follow him to the section of the canal where the strange metallic surface lay hidden beneath the remnants of centuries. The mud had dried slightly overnight, forming a crust that crumbled underfoot but still held enough moisture to cling stubbornly to boots and gloves. When the team stepped aside, Mark led the group closer. The inspectors crouched and touched the metal themselves, brushing away sediment and revealing the dark, oxidized sheen beneath. Their faces changed almost instantly, skepticism replaced by surprise, then by a silent calculation as they exchanged glances. The surface was clearly not part of any known infrastructure. It was too old, too large, too deliberate in its construction. Mark explained what he had observed: the unnatural flatness, the precise seams, the depth at which the structure lay. He outlined his suspicion that they were dealing with an entrance of some kind, a doorway into a sealed chamber beneath the canal. The inspectors listened, some with widening eyes, others with arms folded defensively, but none dismissed him outright. One of them noted that the city's archives were incomplete when it came to older subterranean structures, especially those built before certain catastrophic floods and reconstruction periods. Another pointed out that 19th century engineers had constructed many hidden chambers and tunnels for storage, maintenance, or emergency use, some of which had later been forgotten or sealed during urban expansion. Mark felt vindicated, but the sense of responsibility grew heavier. What lay beneath was no longer his mystery alone. It was now a matter of public concern, historical significance, and perhaps even public safety. He stepped back as the specialists moved forward to survey the area. They used portable ground-penetrating scanners, passing the handheld devices over the mud, watching the early readings form crude images on their screens. The images were distorted by the density of the sediment, but some shapes were unmistakable. Rectangular voids beneath the metallic plate, suggesting hollow space. The narrow shapes along the edges suggested framing or reinforcement, not natural formations. Word of the discovery spread quickly. More officials arrived. Historians arrived. A representative from the local archaeological institute appeared, notebook in hand and questions already forming on their lips. Meanwhile, workers began to clear the mud more systematically, using soft-bristled brushes and careful water sprays to expose more of the structure without damaging it. As the surface grew, the full shape of what they had uncovered began to emerge. It was indeed a door. Massive, reinforced, and built with a craftsmanship that spoke of a time when engineering relied on brute materials and human precision rather than digital calculations. The top of the door curved subtly, following the contour of old architectural styles. Hinges, though eaten by rust, were clearly visible beneath layers of grime. The locking mechanism, long frozen in place, was designed for heavy use, with thick bolts and a wheel-like handle that had once turned to seal the chamber from within. And then, as more mud was washed away, something else appeared. Faint, barely legible markings etched into the metal. Letters, numbers, perhaps a designation or date. Age had eroded them to near invisibility, but the shape of some characters still lingered like ghosts. Mark watched as the experts debated their meaning. Some argued that the characters resembled early industrial tags used to designate storage compartments or maintenance rooms. Others believed they might indicate ownership or official registration. One proposed that the chamber beneath had once been part of a larger network, a system of underground facilities built for reasons long forgotten. The truth was unclear, but one thing was now certain. Whatever was behind the door was older than any of them had anticipated. The city administration gave immediate authorization for the door to be opened, carefully, methodically, under strict supervision. A mobile command center was set up near the canal's edge. Barriers were installed to keep the public at a safe distance, though crowds pressed against them regardless, eager to witness the unfolding mystery. News channels arrived with satellite trucks. A sense of anticipation thickened the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the exposed canal bed and the metallic tang rising from the newly revealed surface. Preparing to open the door was no simple task. Engineers examined the metal's integrity and determined that a controlled approach would be required, as brute force could destabilize the chamber beneath or compromise the structure. They installed support frames around the door to prevent the surrounding mud from collapsing inward when the seal was broken. Gas detectors were lowered near the seams to test for dangerous emissions. Every precaution was taken because the unknown carried risks that no one could afford to ignore. Workers gathered with specialized tools: hydraulic jacks, cutting torches, vibration-minimizing drills. The first step was to loosen the ancient bolts securing the door. The rust was thick, and each bolt required long minutes of careful manipulation. The sound of metal groaning under strain echoed across the empty canal like the slow awakening of some buried beast. Mark stood by, watching closely, feeling each vibration as though it traveled directly into his chest. He could not help imagining the last time the door had been opened, how long ago it must have been, and under what circumstances. The more they worked, the more the door revealed its size. It was taller than a person, wide enough to admit large crates or machinery. It had not been built for convenience, it had been built for purpose. As they exposed the edges further, they discovered reinforced beams lining the perimeter, evidence that this was no simple hatch, but part of a larger, well-engineered system. The beams extended downward, disappearing beneath the mud, hinting at deeper corridors or adjoining chambers. Hours passed as the workers continued their delicate efforts. Crowds grew restless, officials paced anxiously, journalists whispered excitedly among themselves, but Mark remained still, his gaze fixed on the door. He felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear of what they might find, something dangerous, something tragic, something forgotten for good reason. Hope that they had uncovered a piece of history that could change people's understanding of their own city. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last bolt gave way. A hush fell over everyone present, even those standing far away behind the barricades. Engineers approached with tools designed to break the door's seal. Slowly, using thick metal rods for leverage and hydraulic supports to distribute pressure evenly, they began to pry the door open. It resisted at first, clinging to decades of rust and compressed mud. But then, with a low, resonant groan that rippled through the canal like a shudder, the door shifted. A thin crack opened along its edge, and a burst of cold, stale air exhaled from the darkness beyond. The smell was unmistakable. The scent of a place untouched by human presence for generations, sealed in damp isolation beneath earth and water. It carried the mustiness of old wood, decayed materials, trapped moisture, and something else, something metallic and ancient that seemed to whisper of forgotten years. Mark instinctively stepped closer as the door widened. The beam of a flashlight penetrated the gloom, revealing the top of a descending staircase made of old stone or concrete, its steps coated in a thick layer of dust and sediment. The light traveled further, illuminating the faint outlines of walls, wooden beams, and the empty darkness of the chamber below. It was not a small maintenance room. It was not a narrow service tunnel. It was a vast underground space, constructed with purpose and care, its architecture resembling that of 19th-century industrial facilities. The murmurs behind him grew louder. Someone from the Archaeological Institute spoke quickly into a recorder. A city official stepped forward, speechless. Even the workers who had grown used to strange sights stood frozen. This was no everyday discovery. This was a piece of the city's hidden past, a structure sealed and forgotten before any living person had drawn their first breath. Mark stared into the darkness, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The chamber seemed to beckon, as though it had been waiting all this time for someone to rediscover it. And he knew, without any doubt, that this was only the beginning of what the Canal had chosen to reveal. The opening of the door marked a turning point not only in the project but in the life of the city itself. Even as the metal groaned and the stale breath of the underground world seeped outward, Mark felt as though he were standing at the threshold of time itself, witnessing the collapse of a barrier that had kept countless stories locked away in silence. The workers, officials, and curious onlookers all seemed to sense it too. A hush settled over the entire canal as though the city held its breath, waiting to learn what had been hidden beneath its surface for more than a century. The beam of a flashlight trembled slightly in the dimness, carving circles across walls coated in layers of dust and sediment. The stairway descending into the darkness looked worn, but astonishingly intact. Its stone steps, though uneven in places, had not crumbled entirely, a testament to the forgotten builders who had carved out this subterranean world at a time when craftsmanship relied on resilience and precision. Mark descended first, not out of bravado, but out of responsibility. He knew that whatever lay beneath was now his to reveal, since he had been the one to understand that something unnatural lay buried beneath the mud. The others followed behind him cautiously, their footsteps echoing faintly in the still, humid air. Every sound seemed amplified, as if the underground chamber had not heard human presence in so long that it startled at the intrusion. The light illuminated walls made of brick and stone, supported by thick beams that had once been coated with a protective material now cracked and peeling. The corridor at the bottom of the stairs was wider than expected, its floor covered in a thin layer of dried silt, as though water had seeped in at some point before receding again decades ago. Overhead, wooden rafters had warped slightly, but remained mostly intact, forming a narrow spine above their heads. The deeper they moved, the clearer it became that this place had not been built in haste. Everything about it, its dimensions, the uniformity of its walls, the careful reinforcement at structurally crucial points, suggested intention, planning, and long-term use. It was not a random collection of rooms or an improvised shelter. It was a constructed facility, designed with a purpose that had long since been forgotten by the outside world. Mark's flashlight landed on the first of the chambers branching off the main corridor. A heavy wooden door stood half open, swollen with age and humidity. The workers squeezed inside, their boots crunching softly over debris. Inside were rows of wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. Most had collapsed, spilling their contents across the floor, but others remained sealed, their surfaces darkened with time. The labels on them had faded, Yet some letters were still discernible, enough to indicate that they belonged to a period when handwritten inscriptions were still common in industrial storage. The crates held tools, lengths of rope, broken lanterns, rusted metal fittings. On a shelf near the wall lay a ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed. Mark lifted it gently, the paper crackling beneath his fingers. Ink lines danced across the faded pages. Inventory list, dates, annotations in looping cursive handwriting. Many entries referenced materials that no longer existed in modern usage. Historians would later call it a priceless record of daily operations in an era the city had never expected to glimpse again. They moved into the next chamber. Here the air was colder, the darkness deeper. A large table stood in the middle of the room, covered with sheets of paper, some torn, some preserved astonishingly well thanks to their location. The edges curled and the ink had bled in places, yet diagrams were still visible. Blueprints of something large, mechanical sketches, maps with symbols that seemed at first cryptic. Mark bent over one such map, letting the light sweep across its faded lines. It depicted the canal as it had once been, but with additions that did not appear on any modern plan. Narrow tunnels, auxiliary basins, chambers hidden beneath what were now streets and buildings. It was as though the planners of a bygone era had imagined a subterranean world beneath the city's waterways, a parallel infrastructure that never fully came to fruition or had been intentionally concealed. As they continued deeper, the chambers seemed to grow larger, as if the underground structure had expanded gradually over time. Some rooms contained nothing but broken furniture, desks, stools, and cabinets covered in dust. Others held metallic racks and shelving units lined with glass bottles, many of which remained intact. The labels on these bottles were stained and nearly impossible to decipher, but a chemical scent lingered faintly in the air, hinting at the mixtures they once contained. There was no doubt that this area had once been used to store supplies necessary for daily operations, maintenance, or perhaps even trade. Then they came across a door that differed from the rest. Made of reinforced steel and secured by a lock that had rusted shut, it suggested something of more importance beyond its threshold. The workers used specialized tools to break it open, and what emerged from the darkness drew a collective gasp. Inside, illuminated by their flashlights, were rows upon rows of shelves lined with bottles of wine, stored on their sides in perfect formation. The corks had dried and darkened, and the bottles themselves were shrouded in a thin veil of dust, but expert eyes immediately recognized the craftsmanship. Each label bore a crest, a date, and an inscription linking it to a vineyard renowned more than a century ago. Many of those estates no longer existed. Others had been destroyed in fires, wars, or floods, yet here their legacy remained, quietly aging in the darkness, untouched by thieves or collectors. Some bottles had cracked under the strain of time, their contents long evaporated or soaked into the shelves, but many had survived almost miraculously. Historians and enologists would later confirm that this was one of the most significant discoveries of preserved 19th-century wine in modern history, rivaling collections found in shipwrecks and ancient cellars. Mark felt a mixture of awe and disbelief. This alone would have made the discovery groundbreaking, but the underground complex had more secrets to unveil. Beyond the wine chamber lay another room filled with small, locked metal boxes. Some had been left open, their contents spilling onto the floor in scattered brilliance. Coins of silver, embossed with dates ranging from the late 18th to the early 20th centuries, glimmered beneath the flashlight beams. Bundles of documents tied with string lay half hidden under them. On a table nearby sat a series of metal containers engraved with intricate designs. It was a treasury of sorts, a place where valuable objects had been hidden away, untouched by time. At the far end of the room, workers noticed a faint outline beneath collapsed wooden debris. As they cleared the broken fragments, their lights revealed a massive mechanical device, partially dismantled but still imposing. Thick metal rods, gears, pistons, and a large wheel suggested some form of early industrial machinery. Its craftsmanship was meticulous, its purpose unclear. But one thing was obvious. This was no ordinary piece of equipment. Engineers examined it closely, murmuring among themselves. Some theories emerged. It might have been a prototype of a hydraulic pump, an experimental system designed to regulate water levels or aid in controlling flooding during storm seasons. The design bore hallmarks of innovation far ahead of its era. It stood like a frozen relic of industrial ambition, abandoned perhaps during a crisis or sealed away when its creators vanished. The group moved onward, exploring rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the canal. They found workbenches littered with old tools, shelves filled with mechanical parts, half-completed devices, boxes of nails, washers, bolts, and even preserved sets of clothing, coats hardened with age, boots dried into stiff shapes. The sense of human presence was overwhelming. It was as if the workers of this underground facility had walked away abruptly, leaving behind a world intact but frozen in time. But what had driven them out? Why had the entrance been sealed? Why had no record of this vast structure survived in the city's official archives? These questions haunted Mark as he surveyed the complex. It was too organized, too vital, too carefully constructed to have been forgotten accidentally. Someone, at some point in history, had made a deliberate choice to lock these corridors away from the world. As they pushed deeper, the signs of sudden abandonment became clearer. In one chamber, they found a table set with cups and plates, dust-covered but still arranged as if workers had been preparing to eat. Tools lay where they had been dropped mid-task. A lantern hung from a beam, its glass cracked as though knocked aside in haste. In another room, a stack of papers was scattered across the floor, as if someone had overturned a desk during an emergency evacuation. There was no sign of flooding severe enough to cause such a departure, and the absence of personal items or remains suggested a voluntary evacuation rather than disaster. Still, something in the way the rooms were left, the disorder, the incomplete tasks, the open crates, hinted at urgency. The discovery of collapsed areas further added to the mystery. A section of one corridor had caved in, blocking access to what appeared to be another series of rooms beyond it. The beams supporting the ceiling had cracked, splintering under the weight of time or perhaps under the force of an earlier quake or shift of earth. White dust clung to everything, thick and powdery, giving the area a ghostly pallor. Mark was struck by how fragile the space felt in these areas, as though the slightest disturbance could awaken the ruin lying dormant above them. Throughout all of this, he maintained strict oversight of the team, ensuring safety protocols were followed and the findings documented. Yet he could not ignore the way the underground chambers affected him personally. The dim light, the cold, stale air, the whispers of a forgotten workforce, all of it worked its way into his thoughts. He felt as though he were walking through a story, one whose ending had been torn out of the book. The workers began taking measurements, mapping the complex corridor by corridor. Historians scribbled frantic notes, astonished by each new revelation. Engineers spoke quietly into radios as they negotiated how to stabilize the areas without damaging historical artifacts. The city's officials observed with growing awareness of the magnitude of what had been uncovered. And through it all, Mark felt a rising sense of both pride and unease. Pride, because he had recognized the anomaly in the canal bed, because he had insisted on investigating further, because he had helped open a door that revealed one of the most remarkable historical discoveries in the city's memory. Unease, because the silence of the place felt too heavy, its secrets too intentional. Whoever built this complex had done so with conviction. Whoever abandoned it had done so with haste. The last chamber they explored that day left the strongest impression. It was larger than the others, with a high, arched ceiling. Wooden crates were stacked neatly against one wall, each marked with symbols unlike those found elsewhere in the facility. A long metal table stood in the center, covered in dust but still sturdy. On it rested a massive book, bound in thick leather that had cracked along the spine. When Mark carefully opened it, he found page after page of handwritten text, records, signatures, inventory logs, engineering notes, and lists of supplies. But woven into these practical entries were strange notations, cryptic in nature, mentioning schedules, warnings, and references to disturbances in the canal above. The final entry on the very last page had been written in hurried, uneven script. It spoke of an immediate need to seal the entrance, to protect the contents of the chambers, and to ensure that the facility would remain hidden until some unspecified danger had passed. There was no indication of what that danger had been. No explanation, no follow-up, just a final line scrawled with a shaken hand. We close this place with heavy hearts. Whoever finds it, let them understand why. But there was no explanation. Only silence. Mark closed the book slowly, his fingers lingering on the cracked leather. He stared around the room, feeling the weight of countless unanswered questions pressing in from the shadows. Whatever had happened here had left an entire subterranean world suspended in time. And now, after more than a century of darkness, it had awakened. When they finally climbed back to the surface, the light of day felt harsh and unreal. Crowds were still gathered along the canal, waiting eagerly for news. Mark stood in the center of the drained waterbed, looking up at the sky and feeling a chill run through him. The canal, once thought to be nothing more than a polluted relic, had revealed a hidden chapter of the city's past, but it had also revealed a mystery far larger than anyone had anticipated. And he sensed, deep within himself, that the story was far from over. The days that followed the initial exploration of the underground facility were unlike anything the city had experienced in generations. The discovery had already taken on a life of its own. Even though the team had only ventured into a portion of the chambers, word of what lay beneath the drained canal spread with astonishing speed. It was as if the city itself had been waiting for this revelation, and now that it had occurred, the entire world wanted to witness it. Yet, for Mark, the weight of what they had found pressed down heavier each morning. The underground air, the stillness of abandoned rooms, the hurried scrawl in the leather-bound book, all of it lingered in his thoughts long after he stepped back into daylight. A strict schedule was established, ensuring that each part of the complex was examined carefully, documented thoroughly, and disturbed only when necessary. Engineers reinforced the ceiling beams in key sections to prevent collapse, installing temporary supports without altering the historical integrity of the site. Archaeologists worked alongside conservators who treated fragile items as though they were holding faded remnants of a forgotten empire. Historians walked through the room slowly, their voices lowered to hushed tones, as if they had entered a sacred temple. Everything was done meticulously, but the site remained enormous. They had not yet explored every room, nor dared to open every sealed crate. Many mysteries were still buried in the shadows. Mark walked among them each day, guiding the flow of work with a familiarity and caution that earned him the respect of everyone present. He knew the patterns of the canal's old structure better than any map could convey, and his instincts now extended into the underground spaces as though he had grown up navigating their labyrinth. Yet, even as he eased the concerns of engineers and calmed the impatience of officials, he could not help thinking of the deserted table left with plates, cups, and utensils arranged for a meal that was never eaten. The thought haunted him endlessly. Something had happened here, something sudden, something that forced departure before a last sip of water or wine was taken. Though the evidence suggested no catastrophe occurred within these walls, the abruptness of it lingered like a whisper. When the team reached the larger rooms again, particularly the wine chamber, excitement rippled through the entire project staff. Specialists in viniculture arrived, their eyes widening as they realized the significance of what stood before them. Dozens of bottles preserved through sheer chance, shielded from sunlight, heat, and vibration by the chamber's isolation. Some bottles contained sediments crystallized beautifully, indicating exceptional age. Others had labels protected by layers of dust and moisture, showing vineyards whose existence had been recorded only in scarce documents. A scholar who had studied the city's agricultural history nearly wept when he recognized a crest on one bottle, an estate believed to have produced only a handful of vintage series before it was wiped out by a historic flood. The bottles were cataloged, photographed, and handled with the utmost delicacy. Their monetary value was staggering, but their cultural value far surpassed it. They represented an era when wine was more than a drink. It was a symbol of status, craftsmanship, and painstaking devotion. Each bottle contained not only aged liquid, but a piece of human history sealed beneath cork and glass. The chamber itself was something of a miracle. Even the cracked shelves and damaged corks told a story of survival against odds that should have shattered everything inside. Beyond the rows of wine, the next chamber brought even greater astonishment. The metal boxes, rusted, tarnished, some half collapsed, yielded treasures far beyond anyone's expectations. When conservators opened the first box fully, a soft gleam filled the room, coins, elegant in their simplicity, bearing dates that predated major political upheavals. They found silver cutlery with patterns suggesting aristocratic ownership, jewelry sealed in protective cloth that had nearly turned to dust, and ceremonial items whose functions were unclear but whose artistry was undeniable. There were also bundles of documents written in elaborate cursive, tied with string that had hardened over time. The pages were delicate, but once unfurled, they revealed personal letters, receipts, ledgers, and agreements signed by individuals whose names had vanished from modern records. One letter, dated more than a century earlier, spoke tenderly of a merchant's hope to secure his family's future amidst uncertain times. Another contained instructions for transporting valuable goods discreetly through the city. These documents added layers of humanity to the treasure, reminders that behind every crate and every coin stood a life, a family, a set of ambitions and fears. Mark found himself lingering near this chamber often. The sense of tangible connection to the past stirred something deep within him. Working with the canal for years, he had often thought of the city in terms of pipes, currents, and maintenance needs. But now the city revealed itself as something far more intimate, a living archive of stories preserved beneath water and mud. Here, history was not something written in textbooks, it was something one could hold, feel, inhale. Yet, it was the discovery of the machinery that truly electrified the engineering community. The massive device buried under debris in the far corner of the chamber was unlike anything found in ordinary industrial spaces. Its construction bore signs of experimentation, of someone pushing the boundaries of known mechanical design. Engineers studied its components carefully. The curved metal arms, the pistons with unusual alignments, the intricate gears shaped with precision uncommon for their time. Some believed it to be a prototype for a hydraulic system far more advanced than anything the city officially possessed during that era. Mark stood beside the engineers as they analyzed it, absorbing their theories and allowing his mind to wander through the possibilities. Could this machine have been intended to regulate water levels in the canal? Perhaps it was part of a larger project that aimed to transform the waterway system into an efficient mechanism for flood prevention or water distribution. If so, why had it been abandoned? Why had the city chosen not to implement the design? Or had the design been suppressed, either for political or economic reasons lost to time? Even the historians struggled to place the machinery in its proper context. They pored over old newspaper archives, engineering journals from the 19th century, and blueprints from the city's infrastructural expansions. They found scattered references to a visionary engineer, a name no longer familiar, but never enough detail to confirm whether he had designed the machine. What they did find were hints of a debate that had occurred during a period of crisis, discussions about the cost of modernizing the canal, disagreements over whether to invest in innovative solutions or rely on cheaper, more traditional methods. It was possible that the machine represented the road not taken, a bold attempt to reshape the city's future that had been quietly buried along with the chamber itself. As the team moved onward through the complex, they uncovered even more rooms. Some contained mundane items that nonetheless held immense historical value. Tools that had belonged to ordinary workers, hammers, chisels, measuring instruments, had been left exactly where they fell. Shelves of spare parts suggested ongoing maintenance right up until the moment operations suddenly ceased. In one corner lay a stack of lanterns, their glass smoked and their metal frames worn by age. Mark imagined workers carrying them through dark corridors, tending to machines and materials long before electricity illuminated the city's streets. The most haunting rooms were those that displayed clear signs of abandonment. A partially set dining table, covered in layers of dust, looked as if it had been left in the middle of a workday. The chairs around it seemed frozen mid-motion, as if their occupants had risen suddenly and never returned. Tools lay scattered across the floor, some broken, others perfectly intact. A coat hung on a wooden peg near the door, stiff with time, as though the person who had worn it intended to come back for it but never did. Experts debated whether the evacuation had been prompted by danger or by urgency related to external events. There was no evidence of violence, no signs of fire or flooding severe enough to drive people away. But there was the final written entry, the hurried plea to seal the facility. What danger had they been referring to? And why had the deposit remained locked even after so many decades had passed? Mark pondered these questions constantly. His mind returned to the eerie silence of the rooms, the scattered tools, the abandoned food preparations. It was difficult to escape the sense of a moment interrupted, of a chapter cut from the city's history without explanation. It wasn't long before the magnitude of the discovery reached beyond the city. International attention poured in, and suddenly the drained canal became the epicenter of global interest. News agencies from around the world sent reporters to cover the unfolding story. Academics traveled from universities abroad, eager to glimpse the underground marvel. Even governments of other nations expressed interest, seeing in the discovery a chance to study forgotten technologies, vanished architectural traditions, and the hidden workings of 19th century urban planning. The city responded by increasing security around the site and establishing a process for research teams to gain access. Tents and temporary labs sprouted along the canal's banks like a sudden scientific village. Equipment hummed continuously, cameras documenting every artifact, climate control units protecting delicate materials, laptops displaying scanned diagrams and digitized journal entries. There was an electrifying atmosphere of discovery, a sense that history had cracked open and offered a rare glimpse into its unfiltered depths. Mark found himself at the center of it all. Journalists asked him to recount how he had first noticed the anomaly in the mud, how he had suspected something beneath it, what he had felt when the door finally opened. He answered their questions carefully, not seeking attention but understanding that the world was hungry for stories. His calm, measured presence became something of a symbol of the discovery, an image that resonated with the idea of a dedicated worker uncovering the extraordinary beneath the ordinary. Yet, amidst the celebration, excitement, and scholarly fervor, the unanswered questions lingered. Why had the chamber existed in the first place? Why had it been sealed? Why had it been forgotten by the city's official history? And what was the meaning behind the cryptic final entry in the leather-bound book? The discovery of valuables, wine, machinery, and documents explained how the facility had been used, but not why it had been abandoned. One evening, long after the last visitors had left and the researchers had packed up for the night, Mark stood alone at the entrance to the underground structure. The lights inside cast long, stretching shadows across the stone walkway. The quiet beneath the earth felt different from the quiet above. It had a deepness, a density, as though the walls themselves absorbed sound and memory alike. He thought of the people who had once worked here, engineers, laborers, clerks, craftsmen. They had built something extraordinary beneath the canal, a place of ingenuity and purpose. They had left behind traces of their world, their hopes and their fears. Standing there, Mark felt as though he were walking among their echoes, and he wondered what message they would have wanted future generations to understand. The surface world buzzed with excitement. The underground world remained still, shouldering its secrets with dignified silence. The stage was set for revelations the city had never imagined, and Mark sensed that the story was not yet finished. The transformation that followed the discovery unfolded gradually, yet with an inevitability that made it feel as though the city had been waiting for this moment for more than a century. The underground complex, with its labyrinth of chambers, relics, machinery, and unanswered questions, had already reshaped the way people viewed the drained canal. But in the weeks that followed, it began reshaping far more. Policies, historical narratives, civic pride, and quietly but profoundly, the life of the man who had first sensed that something extraordinary lay beneath the mud. Mark's story became the thread that tied the entire unfolding saga together. Though he had never sought recognition, the city now looked to him as the man who had quite literally uncovered its forgotten heart. His quiet diligence, his intuitive understanding of the canal, and his calm under pressure made him stand out amid the chaos of media frenzy and scholarly speculation. Interviews, documentaries, and articles mentioned his name again and again, painting him as a symbol not only of expertise, but of modest dedication, someone who had worked for years in obscurity, maintaining the arteries of the city, only to become the key that unlocked a buried past. Yet, for Mark, the attention brought mixed feelings. On the one hand, there was pride. Genuine, humble pride in having contributed something meaningful, something lasting. On the other hand, there was the unfamiliar and uncomfortable weight of constant scrutiny, of people analyzing his every word, of strangers approaching him on the street to shake his hand or thank him. He remained focused on the work, guiding the team still exploring the deepest corridors of the underground chambers, overseeing safety measures, coordinating with engineers, and helping historians map the subterranean layout. His heart remained tethered to the discovery itself, not the praise that came with it. The city leadership honored him formally during a ceremony held on the steps of the town hall. Thousands of people filled the square, the building draped in banners celebrating the historic breakthrough. The mayor spoke of Mark's perseverance and insight, of his years of service to the city, of the symbolic meaning of his role in uncovering a treasure trove of knowledge. Mark stood before the crowd, uncomfortable in the spotlight, yet aware that turning away from it would seem ungracious. He accepted the plaque, the handshake, the applause, but when he spoke, his words were simple. He thanked his team, the engineers, the workers, the historians, everyone who had stood knee-deep in mud or bent over dusty shelves in the underground chambers to help bring the truth to light. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed him once again, but he answered only what was necessary before slipping away to the canal. Drawn to its evolving landscape, the canal bed no longer looked like the alien wasteland it had once been. Much of the mud had been removed, the debris cleared, and the structural work reinforced. What had appeared at first like a scar now resembled a clean foundation. Soon, the final phase of the restoration would begin, refilling the canal with fresh water. Mark stood on the edge of the stone embankment and imagined the water shimmering again beneath the bridges. He pictured families strolling along the sidewalks, boats drifting slowly down the current, children pausing to watch ducks glide on the surface. For the first time in decades, the canal would be something beautiful, something proud, something that connected the city to its own history rather than reminding it of its neglect. The water returned gradually, regulated to ensure that no pressure threatened the underground structure. As the canal filled inch by inch, the city watched with bated breath. The moment the water reached its full depth, fountains erupted from the banks in celebration, sending arcs of glittering spray into the cold air. Citizens gathered en masse to witness the rebirth of a landmark they had long given up on. The reflection of the surrounding buildings shimmered once again on the surface, bouncing golden light upward as though the canal had not been dry and lifeless only weeks before. Even with the canal restored, the excitement surrounding the underground complex did not diminish. On the contrary, interest deepened. Museums, universities, and cultural institutes organized events, conferences, and exhibitions dedicated to the discovery. The city commissioned a permanent museum near the canal, designed specifically to house the most significant artifacts uncovered from the chambers. Construction began immediately, with architects striving to create a structure that paid homage both to the historic elegance of the city and the modern spirit of revelation. The museum, once completed, stood like a thoughtful nod to the past. Its exterior combined stonework reminiscent of the 19th century buildings surrounding the canal with subtle contemporary lines. Inside, softly lit halls guided visitors through immersive exhibits, detailed replicas of the underground chambers, preserved bottles of wine, restored tools and equipment, carefully displayed documents and letters, and a reconstructed section of the mysterious machine. Curators ensured that the narrative honored the workers who had once lived their lives within those hidden walls, and the laborers and engineers who rediscovered them. Mark became an informal consultant for the museum's development. Though he did not wield authority in matters of design or historical interpretation, the curators valued his perspective. He knew the space intimately, its angles, its atmosphere, the feeling of pressing one's hand against the cool, silent brick. He advised on the arrangement of exhibits in ways that would evoke the same sense of wonder he had experienced when he first ascended the stairwell. In one section of the museum, a small plaque bore his name, recognizing his vital role in the discovery. Visitors often paused before it, imagining the moment when a quiet, methodical worker uncovered the first clue that led to the revelation of a century-old secret. As the months passed and the initial frenzy settled into a steady stream of public fascination, the discovery began shaping the city's collective identity. Schools incorporated the story into their history curriculums, using it to teach students about archaeology, urban planning, engineering, and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. Tourist guides developed new routes that traced the path of the canal, the museum, and scenic overlooks near the access points leading to the underground chambers. Restaurants offered themed dishes inspired by 19th-century cuisine. Local businesses capitalized on the newfound attention while also paying homage to the spirit of cultural preservation that now permeated the community. For Mark, however, the greatest transformation occurred within himself. Before the discovery, he had seen his work largely as a matter of responsibility, serving the city by maintaining the unseen systems that kept it running. It was honorable work, but thankless. No one ever stopped to wonder who ensured the canals flowed smoothly, who inspected the underground tunnels, who repaired old valves or prevented backups that could have caused disasters. Yet now, as he stood on the canal's bank and watched the water ripple beneath the bridges, he understood something profound. His years of labor had not simply maintained the city, they had connected him to it. They had given him knowledge that was both practical and intuitive, knowledge that had allowed him to recognize something no one else had noticed. And through that recognition, he had helped restore not just a forgotten space beneath the canal, but a part of the city's soul. The discovery had become a bridge, linking the living city to the ghosts of those who had built, worked, and dreamed within its hidden depths. This realization filled him with a quiet sense of belonging. He no longer felt like someone who simply worked beneath the surface of public life. He felt like a steward of something larger, a guardian of history and memory. When he walked through the underground chambers now, he sensed not only the presence of the past but the connection of past to present, a continuous thread woven through time. One evening, Mark visited the museum shortly after its opening, walking alone through its halls long after the crowds had departed. The exhibits glowed softly in the dim lights. The preserved bottles shimmered behind glass. The giant machine sat like a sleeping giant, its gears frozen in eternal silence. In the reconstructed section of the corridor, he paused and let his hand rest lightly against the brick, feeling an echo of the moment he had stood in the real chamber and breathed its century-old air. He looked around, seeing the stories of the workers, engineers, merchants, and families who had unknowingly contributed their lives and dreams to the hidden archive beneath the city. For a moment, Mark closed his eyes. He imagined the bustling workshop the chamber must have once been, the echo of hammers, the murmur of voices, the shuffling of crates, the flicker of lantern light. He imagined a worker pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, never knowing that the artifacts around him would one day become priceless relics. He imagined the engineer who had sketched the blueprint of the mysterious machine, dreaming of a future city that might harness new technology, and he imagined the final day when someone wrote in hurried script that the chambers must be sealed and left for those who would come later. The past felt closer than ever, not distant or unreachable, but alive in the air around him. When he stepped back outside, the evening sky was growing dark. The canal flowed quietly beside the museum, the water carrying the glow of street lamps in long, trembling streaks. People walked along the banks. Families, couples, children chasing reflections. Music drifted from a nearby cafe. Laughter echoed gently under the arches of the bridge. Mark paused and leaned on the railing, watching the current drift beneath him. The canal that had once been a forgotten artery filled with debris was now a symbol of renewal. It carried with it the city's gratitude, its rediscovered pride, and its deepened sense of history. He inhaled the cool night air and let the moment settle inside him. The canal had spoken, revealing its hidden truth, and in doing so, it had rewritten the city's story. But it had also rewritten his own. He knew, standing there, that although the chambers had been sealed long ago, nothing remained buried forever. Not history, not hope, not the quiet dedication of someone who believed deeply in his work. The water flowed on, restored and alive, carrying with it the memory of what lay beneath. And Mark, gazing into its shimmering depths, understood that he had become part of that memory, woven into the fabric of the city he had served his entire life. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next videos on the channel. Each one uncovers something you won't expect. And share this video with others so more people can discover this story.